With former President Donald Trump's indictment comes a historical moment, for Trump is the first U.S. president to ever be charged with criminal activity. Whether you agree with the charges or not, that's not the point of this video. Because I wanted to use the news of Trump's indictment to start a discussion about an interesting topic in history. While Trump may be the first president to be officially charged with a crime, some presidents did some incredibly scandalous things that almost, or in some cases did, end their political careers entirely.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
In the 247 years that the United States has existed as an independent country, we have had 45 people elected to the Oval Office, and this small group of human beings have proven to be a rather shady group overall. But there are two presidential scandals that were so bad that they threatened the very lives of the presidents. Before we begin, I want to remind you all to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell if you learn anything new in this video and want to learn more fascinating history in the future. Republican Warren G. Harding was elected to the presidency in 1920. When he announced his intention to run for president, his chances of winning even the Republican nomination seemed incredibly unlikely. But the country was in a crisis. The Democratic administration of Woodrow Wilson had left the U.S. in a precarious state. After promising to not get the U.S. involved in World War I during his re-election campaign, the U.S. got involved anyways. With millions of Americans preparing for war, the Spanish flu outbreak that would occur soon afterward left the country in constant fear. Race relations would continue to worsen throughout the early 20th century, and to add to this, massive labor strikes in 1919 would lead to widespread fear of a communist revolution, like the ones that had just destroyed Russia. The American people were desperate for change. This is where Harding would step in, promising a return to normalcy and, quote, less government and business and more business and government. This last part would prove to be more true than the American people would like. With his election behind him, Harding began building his cabinet. While Harding appointed some very capable men into his cabinet, like Herbert Hoover as his Secretary of Commerce, he also chose incredibly poorly for some of his other positions, particularly his Secretary of Interior. Albert Fall had been making his way up the political ranks while working as a very effective lawyer in New Mexico during the late 1800s. Going from New Mexico's House of Representatives to even being made an Associate Justice on Mexico's Supreme Court. As his political career thrived, he began to associate more and more with his neighbor, Oliver Lee. Lee had a reputation as a dangerous man. Lee would regularly raid nearby ranches to steal people's cattle, and if anyone tried to stop him, he often employed the services of two gunmen, William McNew and Jim Gilliland. If Lee ever did get caught for his crimes, Albert Fall used his influence and legal expertise to ensure Lee and his associates' freedom. These men would start making a reputation for themselves around New Mexico. They were to be feared, and they always got what they wanted, until attorney Albert Jennings Fountain stepped in. Fountain recognized what Fall and Lee were doing and was disgusted. Rather than fearing the men, Fountain openly criticized Fall and Lee and challenged them in court whenever he could. Fall and Lee had to do something, so on February 1st, 1896, Fountain and his 8-year-old son disappeared and were never seen again. All the available evidence pointed towards Lee and his gunmen as the murderers, and they were arrested and charged with murder. But the prosecutors ran into a corrupt court and Fall himself. Soon, all three men were acquitted and never faced justice. A few years later, legendary Sheriff Pat Garrett decided to reopen the investigation into Fountain's disappearance. Garrett had made a name for himself for being the man to finally kill Billy the Kid and was determined to bring Fall and his accomplices to justice. But as soon as he began his investigation, he too was murdered. The man accused of killing Garrett, Jesse Wayne Brazel, was arrested and charged with murder. But what do you know, his lawyer Albert Fall secured Brazel's acquittal after only one day in court. So Fall was not a man to be trusted, but he had made friends with several people that President Harding would place in his cabinet. With these connections and probably a failure to vet his past, Fall was appointed as Harding's Secretary of Interior in March 1921, and Fall got to work looking for an opportunity to enrich himself. He quickly found it in the oil fields around the Teapot Dome in Wyoming and Buena Vista in Elk Hills, California. These massive oil fields had been under the supervision of the Navy, who were withholding these sites from oil production as an emergency reserve of oil in case of war. But Fall saw their potential to make him rich. These oil fields were worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and Fall used his position as Secretary of Interior to access them. He successfully convinced the all-too-trusting Warren Harding to transfer the oil fields from the Navy to the Department of the Interior. Once the lands were transferred to his department, Fall secretly contacted his longtime friends Harry Sinclair and Edward Doheny, owners of the Mammoth Oil Company and Pan American Petroleum Company, respectively. The three men made a backroom deal where Fall agreed to lease the oil sites to the two oil tycoons and in return, the oil companies agreed to build an oil storage facility at the naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and to construct an oil pipeline from Wyoming to Kansas City. But that was just a small contribution the oil companies were to make for the federal government. The real compensation the oil companies were to pay was to Albert Fall directly. Edward Doheny agreed to quote-unquote loan $100,000 to Fall, interest-free, so Fall could purchase a massive New Mexico ranch, while Harry Sinclair would deliver a large herd of cattle to Fall's ranch and fork over $300,000 worth of Liberty bonds in cash to Fall's son-in-law. While Fall and the oil companies were making a fortune on Fall's corruption, local Wyoming townspeople started noticing trucks branded with Sinclair's logo hauling oil-producing equipment to Teapot Dome. When the media heard about this, they immediately reported the illegal drilling. Local oil companies that were left out of the deal were furious. One oilman, Colonel James G. Darden, decided to start drilling at Teapot Dome out of spite of the secret deal. In response, Albert Fall demanded that Warren Harding send in the Marines to stop Darden from drilling. Not knowing what to do, Harding agreed. At this point, Harding was aware of at least some of what Albert Fall was doing, but he had no idea how to handle it. He was also learning that some of his other cabinet members were also partaking in corrupt business dealings, though nowhere near the scale of Albert Fall's corruption. Completely devastated, Harding would complain to a newspaper editor, William Allen White, with, quote, "I have no trouble with my enemies. I can take care of my enemies all right. But my damn friends, my goddamn friends, White, they're the ones who keep me walking the floor at night." End quote. With the scandals piling up around him and knowing that the nation was going to find out sooner or later, Harding would ask his Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, quote, "If you knew of a great scandal in our administration, would you, for the good of the country and the party, expose it publicly, or would you bury it?" Hoover told the president to expose it, but Harding was terrified of what the public's response would be and how it would affect his career. Harding knew that his decision to transfer the oil fields from the Navy to the Department of the Interior would doom him. Unfortunately, Harding would never know what the repercussions would have been, because Harding would die suddenly on August 2nd, 1923, probably due to a heart attack. As for Albert Fall, Fall would be placed under a Senate investigation. The investigation quickly discovered Fall's corruption, and in the fall of 1929, Fall was convicted of taking bribes and fined $100,000 and sentenced to 1 year in prison, becoming the first presidential cabinet member to ever be sentenced to prison. The next presidential scandal that I want to talk about did not actually occur while the president was in office. This scandal also pains me to talk about because this man is probably my favorite historical figure of all time, and I honestly believe him to be the best American to ever live, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant is probably the most misunderstood president in American history, and is often blamed for the mistakes of people around him. You see, Grant's biggest mistake while in office was being way too trusting to people that never deserved his trust. This led to some serious scandals while he was president, and while these scandals would certainly fit in this video, I want to discuss a scandal that occurred after his presidency had long ended. One thing you have to understand about Grant in order to understand how this scandal happened is that Grant was incredibly bad at business. All throughout Grant's life, Grant would fail over and over again when it came to business ventures. It seemed Grant was only ever successful at two things, being a family man and being a general. In 1883, Grant had heard great things about his son's Wall Street brokerage house called Grant & Ward. Believing in his son and recognizing the popularity of Ferdinand Ward, a young up-and-comer in Wall Street, Grant decided to invest $100,000 of his own money in their firm, completely unaware that he was investing in what would soon be revealed as a Ponzi scheme, as Ferdinand Ward paid astronomical interest to investors while secretly stealing the money from the firm's bank vaults. When investors began to get suspicious of Ward's firm, Ward would always bring up Ulysses S. Grant's investment in the company. With Grant's stellar reputation, the firm must be legitimate, so the investors poured money into the firm. When Ward finally began to run out of investors and the money began to quickly disappear, he knew of one person that was so bad at business that he could quickly get one last investment from, Ulysses S. Grant. When Ward told Grant about the firm's precarious position, he explained to Grant that he just needed one more investment to get the firm back in action. But by this point, Grant had invested his entire life savings into the firm. So Grant approached the incredibly wealthy businessman William Henry Vanderbilt for a loan. When Grant explained what the loan was for, Vanderbilt saw through Ward's firm for what it was, a Ponzi scheme. Vanderbilt had a ton of respect for Grant as the Civil War hero and president, so he offered to give Grant a personal loan of $150,000, but advised Grant to not hand it over to Ward. Grant didn't listen. Grant wholeheartedly believed in Ferdinand Ward and handed every last penny of the $150,000 to Ward. Ward disappeared with the money, and Grant and many others were left holding the bag. In fact, so many people had invested in Grant and Ward that its collapse would lead to the Panic of 1884. Vanderbilt offered to forgive the debt that Grant owed him, but Grant refused, so Grant transferred nearly all of his assets, including his home, to Vanderbilt, though Vanderbilt allowed Grant's family to remain in the home. Completely broke and soon after diagnosed with terminal throat cancer, Grant desperately searched for a way to provide for his family after his death. He began work on his memoirs and struggled through incredible pain from his cancer to release his book before he died, successfully doing so a mere 5 days before his death. Grant's friend Mark Twain published his book after his death, and it became a bestseller and left his wife very wealthy. As for Ward, Ward was eventually caught and a few months after Grant's death would be sentenced to 6.5 years in prison for fraud. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.